The ringtone cut through a Saturday morning, and I held the phone in the dark until the message finished playing, then replayed it 3 times to make sure I had not misheard my own name. My name is Marcus Hale, I am 38, and for the last 9 years I ran the fund accounting team at a mid-sized investment shop that paid my mortgage and felt like a second family. I listened to the voicemail until the blue light on the screen blurred, then set the phone face down on the nightstand and let the house settle back into its ordinary sounds. The ordinary sounds were what I had built my life around. On weekdays the kettle clicked at 6:20, the dog thumped his tail against the back door at 6:32, and my son would be at the kitchen table at 6:45 with a juice box and a crayon smear somewhere on his sleeve. My wife trusted me to be steady. She trusted that I understood money, rules, and how to keep a ledge from tipping. At the office we arrived early and stayed late. We traded barbs over coffee, argued about soccer lineups, and pretended not to notice when someone brought pastries on a Friday. I knew the rhythm of that place like the back of my hand. The familiarity felt like armor, and for years that armor kept the lines between home and work neat and intact. I had been proud of what we did. Fund accounting was not glamorous. We balanced numbers that others used to sleep better, we chased down small inconsistencies that could turn into major liabilities, and we took satisfaction from clean reconciliations. My team was lean and efficient, and I kept a calendar of deadlines so precise that team members joked they would rather hand me their children than an unbalanced trial balance. There was pride in that competence and comfort in the way the office functioned as a predictable machine. So when the first whispers started, I treated them as inconveniences, as paperwork errors that would be corrected over coffee and a few extra hours in front of a monitor. Someone said the word shortfalls softly in a hallway conversation, as if saying it too loudly would make it real. Another time, Anna from operations let slip that one of the quarterly reports was messier than usual, and I nodded and offered to take a look. I had spent 9 years building systems that caught errors. My first instinct was to apply the system again. A mistake, I told myself, was a mistake. I could fix a mistake. That Saturday morning, I wandered into the kitchen with the phone still warm in my palm and looked at the drawings tacked to the fridge, each figure sketched with a crayon certainty that made my chest ache. My son had drawn the house with a square that was definitely the office and a smaller square that was definitely our home. He labeled them with sticky note captions, and his handwriting made both places look like fortresses. Taping those pictures up had been my wife's idea, a way to keep us all oriented when the workweek blurred. I felt the weight of those papers as if they were tied to my collar. The message I had replayed was ambiguous enough to let my imagination fill in the edges. It was a voice I recognized, clipped and careful, asking me to come in early on Monday. There was no accusation, no explicit request to hide anything. That made the silence afterward worse. My mind started to populate scenarios, a construction project of small deceptions that somehow led to a larger whole. In those first, tentative hours, I still believed in the mechanics of our operations. I pictured spreadsheets with one miskeyed cell, a misplaced journal entry, a reconciler who had been sleepy that week. I pictured my team huddled around a screen, exasperated and then triumphant when the numbers lined up. I had been through tight audits and client screams that felt like the death of routine, and each time the office pulled together and the world moved on. That pattern hardened into a mental habit: problem, process, fix. My marriage had come to rest on that habit. My wife relied on my steadiness not because she was naive, but because I had demonstrated competence for a decade. I paid the mortgage, I made the calls, I returned the emails at odd hours. Stability is sometimes less of a moral position than it is a ledger entry that balances. Even so, some things did not settle when they were supposed to. The word shortfalls loosened something in me that an audit had never touched. It changed the flavor of the coffee in my mouth, the softness of the morning light. I found myself replaying work conversations, trying to reconcile a memory of someone laughing about a late wire with my knowledge of approval flows in custody. The more I told myself that this was probably paperwork, the more my skin prickled with the sense that I was glancing at a shadow and pretending it was a tree. I went about the weekend like a man half awake. I mowed the lawn because it was easier than thinking, and when I made coffee I watched the steam rise and imagined the invisible hands of controls and policies everywhere, settling like dust. I knew the office politics and how silence could be a strategy. I knew that rumors could be the beginning of sorting and also the cover for something worse. My training told me to look for documentation, for dates and signatures, for the small things that habits forget and paper keeps. My intuition told me to be careful. My home life told me to be steady. When Monday arrived, the rhythm resumed, at least on the surface. People said hello like they always did. The office hummed with the same undercurrent of competitiveness and camaraderie, but I felt different, tuned to a frequency that made ordinary sounds sharp. The idea that a conversation could turn into a liability had settled into me. For the moment, I let the familiar routines act as a balm. I reviewed a reconciliation, I corrected a transposition, I smiled at a joke about last weekend's match. Deep down, I had already started to inventory possibilities. I made a private list in my head of the documents I would want if something needed proving. I did not say any of this aloud. I told myself I was just being thorough. At that stage, the most dangerous thing was what I did not yet understand. I assumed error, not malice. I trusted our systems because I had helped build them and because trust had become shorthand for who I was to my family. That assumption was the last place I felt safe. One Tuesday, an executive pulled me into a closed room and told me that someone had siphoned cash over several quarters and that the board preferred silence to spectacle. The windows were drawn tight against the afternoon, the blinds filtering the city into thin bars of gray, and the room smelled faintly of cheap cologne and burnt coffee. He sat behind a lacquered desk that felt too big for his posture. He folded and unfolded his hands like a man arranging receipts. "This is delicate," he said. "We don't need a press circus. Keep it internal." The implication was clear without him finishing the sentence. Keep it quiet or be part of the problem. I told myself I understood the desire for discretion, legal teams, clients, markets, but when I asked for specifics, the veneer of process cracked. I presented reconciliations I'd run that morning, 3 years of trial balances with every difference highlighted, and watched his eyes skim like a bored auditor. He nodded once, very small, then slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. There was a name circled on that printout, not a title, not a department, a name, underlined in red. The thin smile that accompanied the gesture wasn't cruelty so much as expectation. "This is what you saw, now look away." It felt like a dare. I asked who had signed off on the transfers. He talked about sweeps and temporaries, a string of corporate euphemisms that thinned into, "We need to manage this quietly. We trust you to handle it." Handle it. The word sat on my tongue like a coin I didn't want to accept. I asked more questions. How long had this been going on? Who had access? Who authorized the movements? His answers were clipped, rehearsed. At one point he said, "You understand why we're asking for discretion," and I did. I understood the stakes, but I also understood controls. I could trace the wires, the approvals, the timestamps. Every control I could think to invoke lived in spreadsheets and logs and audit trails. He gave me the printout and the thin smile, and then, as if the scene had been appropriately stage-managed, suggested we take this offline. After that meeting, the room I had known for 9 years began to feel like a theater set. I kept showing up early and staying late because the routines were all I had to hang on to, but little things shifted. Invitations to senior meetings stopped arriving. Where I had once been the one to present reconciliations for review, I was now asked to support from behind, a euphemism that translated into the quiet reassignment of login credentials and a polite email changing ownership of key files. My calendar filled with vague trainings and cross-functional shadowing that felt designed to be busy work. HR called it a temporary restructuring. My boss called it a reassignment while the board evaluates resourcing. Everyone used words like temporary and support and transition, but the texture of the change was sharp and unmistakable. The team that used to rely on me for answers started directing questions elsewhere. When I forwarded the reconciliations showing where the shortfalls began, my emails went unanswered long enough for second-guessing to settle in. At the coffee station, colleagues would turn away mid-conversation. Someone started a whisper that I was difficult, as if having standards were an offense. What made it worse than isolation was the feeling that this had been coordinated. The polite phrasing of the reassignment, the way my access was downgraded in a single afternoon, the way an informal list of shared concerns cropped up in the leadership inbox with my name conspicuously on it, all of it felt orchestrated to place me outside the story they wanted to tell. Old friends who had texted me about weekend plans stopped responding. Lunch invitations I had taken for granted dissolved into silence. A colleague I had mentored for 5 years stopped answering my calls because her manager told her it would be awkward to engage. I tried to push back at first with the only language they seemed to accept, numbers. I brought printed reconciliations, wire confirmations, time-stamped logs. I walked into meetings with a binder of evidence and left with polite nods and the same thin smiles. Once, when I asked why my team's sign-off trail had gaps, a director leaned back and said, "Sometimes things move faster than the paperwork," as if I should be grateful that the business was thriving. The implication was efficiency over formality, compromise for the greater good. Shame crawled into the spaces that used to be warm with camaraderie. It is a particular kind of shame to see your own colleagues arrange you into a narrative where your credibility is the variable to be negotiated away. The people who had traded barbs with me over coffee were suddenly committed to a script in which I was the outlier, the thorn. It felt like betrayal, not because they had turned on me in anger, but because they had folded me into a convenient silence, as if their loyalty had a capacity limit and I had exceeded it. I told my wife only a fraction of what was happening. At the kitchen table, she asked the practical questions: "Is your job threatened? Do we need to talk to our lawyer?" And I deflected because the truth was both larger and more indecent than a simple yes or no. There is a private arithmetic to these things: the mortgage, the child, the neighborhood, the professional reputation. Every potential move multiplied the risk. The safer calculations urged lowering my head, doing my job, letting the board's people manage their mess. But the other part of me, the part that had spent years finding the one keyed cell and fixing it, bristled. As the days bled into weeks, the office's pulse kept going. Meetings went on, bonuses were discussed, and travel plans made. I found myself moving through the building like a ghost, a presence that could be seen but was not consulted. When someone passed me in the corridor, they would give a perfunctory nod and look away, as if acknowledging a storm cloud without getting wet. The isolation felt intentional, an unspoken agreement among them to contain the problem by containing me. What hurt the most was the quiet choreography, how easily the people I trusted had learned to pretend they had not seen what they had seen. They didn't need to lie, they only needed to withhold. In that withholding, they created a buffer between themselves and consequence, and between me and truth. I sat at my desk one night after everyone had left and turned the circled name over in my head until it felt like the only solid object in the room. The thin smile that had asked me to look away kept replaying. I had a choice to fold into their silence or to refuse it, and for the first time since I had let my son draw the office on the fridge, the ledger felt like it would define me beyond a paycheck. I found the thread by accident, pulling up an old project folder while looking for a memo. The folder name was so mundane I almost didn't click it, Q3 Ops Archive, but something in me wanted to see the templates we'd used a year before. The archive opened in a gray browser frame and the company chat window scrolled up like a throat clearing. Names, timestamps, status indicators I hadn't seen in months. At first it was civilities, the usual. "Nice work on the deck, let's sync next week," the kind of white noise that keeps an office polite. Then a line cut through the static. "Park the discrepancy until the close window," read a message from a senior director I had once admired. It was casual, the kind of terse idiom executives used when they wanted to remind everyone they were thinking in quarters. Below it, a reply I recognized as a finance SVP. "Agreed. QTR timing works well for smoothing." Someone reacted with a laughing emoji. Seeing those words sitting there, no stage-managed smile, no carefully curt answer, was like finding a photograph of a face you thought you'd only glimpsed in shadow. The chat threaded back through the period when the transfers I had flagged occurred. The timestamps were precise. I scrolled and another message appeared, banal and ordinary: "Make sure it's parked under operations, keeps the external teams calm." A few more messages joking about lucky timing and quarter-end wizardry. Black text on white, casual and unguarded, lined up against the printed circled name that had been slid across the lacquered desk. I sat back in my chair and felt a cold come over me that wasn't just the office air conditioning. It wasn't the pinprick dismay I'd felt in the meeting room. This was a slow, gathering indignation. The polite script they'd been playing out for me, discretion, handling it internally, wasn't about prudence. It was a strategy. They'd been planning optics while money moved. Fear tightened in my chest, as immediate and familiar as a tightening bolt. If I did nothing, I would carry their silence like a stain. If I acted, I might lose everything: my job, the house, the sense of stability I'd promised my family. I thought of my son at the kitchen table, of the way he drew the office with little stick figures and a lopsided building. I thought of the mortgage and of my wife's steady voice offering always practical questions. Those images steadied something that panic tried to scatter. I didn't sleep that night. I closed the office door behind me when the cleaning crew switched off the lights and became very deliberate about what I did and how I did it. I had to be careful not just about what I copied, but how I preserved the story so it couldn't be dismissed as a clever reconstruction. First, I made archival copies of the chat thread. I didn't screenshot haphazardly. I exported the logs, saving them as PDFs that printed the header information, dates, participant IDs, server timestamps. Then I printed a set to paper and slid them into a manila folder, the way I'd been trained to keep reconciliations. Paper has an old authority. Someone can scrawl over pixels, but ink on a page feels harder to argue down. Next, I pulled up the reconciliations I'd been running for months and ran a fresh export. Where possible, I saved native files and also printed them to PDF with the metadata visible: cell formulas, last modified stamps, audit trails. I knew enough to understand that a simple copy could create new creation dates, so I annotated each export with a note of the original file path and the server timestamps. It wasn't forensic grade, but it was honest work. Someone later could see where there was continuity. There were the notes, 2 scribbles from meetings, a list of transfer IDs I had been told to destroy as part of a cleanup. The paper had been waiting in my desk for days, and that instruction to shred had felt like an order to erase a memory. I photographed every sheet with my phone in raw light and with high resolution, then transferred the images to an encrypted folder. I kept the paper originals for a while longer because evidence is sometimes more stubborn when it still smells like a meeting room. My hands shook when I copied the transaction confirmations. I matched timestamps from the chat to the ledger entries and watched the lines fall into place. Where there had been a gap, the chat supplied motive. Where there had been an unexplained sweep, the chat supplied instruction. The cognitive dissonance I had carried between decades of training to protect clients and the faces behind those client accounts fractured into clarity. This was deliberate, not an accounting irregularity to be papered over. I thought about the people who would be hurt if this went public. There were innocents caught in the net, and the idea of upending lives made me hesitate. But the other arithmetic held: long-term harm from covering it up, the slow corrosion of my own integrity, the message it would send to my son if I chose peace over truth. The ledger at home, the one where we balanced time and honesty, shifted. I owed him better than silence dressed up as prudence. By 3 in the morning, the office smelled like paper and stale coffee, and the fluorescent light had gone from clinical to oppressive. I labeled folders, wrote a list of who had seen what, and slid a small external drive into my pocket, encrypted, innocuous, heavy with a decision. Before I left, I sat at my desk and let the quiet press in until it felt like the point of a compass. I could picture the next few days as a map: whom to contact, what to protect, how to make sure the thread I had found could not be easily unraveled. Fear didn't go away. It hummed at the edges like a distant traffic noise. But beneath it was a new, steadier calculation. The cost of silence was not just my reputation. It was a tacit surrender of the thing I wanted to be for my son and for myself. I folded the manila folder, tucked the printed PDFs inside, and left the building with a hollow, decisive certainty that whatever came next, I would not be the one who pretended I had not seen. I became deliberate in the way someone learns to breathe underwater. Every movement had to be measured, slow, unobtrusive. Mornings I arrived early, same as always, carrying a thermos and a stack of reconciliations that looked victimless on the surface. I smiled at whoever was at the front desk, made a point of asking about weekend plans, and kept my tone light in meetings so nobody could point to a change and call it paranoia. If anyone glanced at my badge logs, they would see the same hours, the same routines. What the logs did not show was the work I did once the fluorescent hum went thin and the office settled into a soft echo. I organized everything as if I were building a criminal case and a scrapbook at once. Each export had a story attached to it, why I had pulled it, when, and under what authority. I kept a ledger of my own. On a lined legal pad, I recorded file names, server paths, the exact time I had clicked export, and which machine I had used. Where possible, I ran checksums on files to prove they were identical copies of what lay on the server at that moment. When someone asked me in passing for a reconciliation, I moved it to the printer queue and timed my copies to those legitimate actions so my extra prints would not stand out. My attorney friend Rachel became my sounding board and my risk mitigation plan. I did not hand over files to her at first. Instead, I described what I had found, read her the chat lines, and listened while she broke down the legal boundaries for me in plain language. She told me specifically not to access systems I was not authorized to touch, not to remove original files from company servers, and not to alter timestamps or logs. Her advice was surgical. Preserve what you lawfully can, create copies that demonstrate where the originals live, and never, under any circumstances, stage a confrontation or leak without legal counsel. She recommended that I keep at least one sealed copy with a neutral third party if things escalated, and she arranged to have a list of chain of custody steps ready if I needed them. That list became a checklist I followed obsessively. I called in a favor from Tom, a former colleague who had moved into IT audit at a different firm. He showed me how to export chat logs with header information intact, how to include the server timestamps that administrators could verify, and how to capture message IDs so they could be traced back. He warned me about common traps like screenshots that can be easily dismissed as fabrications, and encouraged me to rely on exports and checksum proofs instead. Where my access was limited, I used public behaviors as cover. If I needed a printout of a reconciliation to cross-reference with a chat thread, I would request it during a routine audit prep meeting or say I was preparing backup documentation for an external review. When I had to photograph handwritten notes I had been told to shred, I did it at my desk with the door open and the lights on, pretending to reorganize. I kept these actions visible because visibility provided plausible explanations. If anyone noticed a stack of papers on my desk, they would see only a manager doing the paperwork managers do. The invention of ordinary duties became my cloak. At night, I moved more boldly. I used a laptop that was not linked to any company account to store copies, and I encrypted every external drive with passphrases I alone could remember. I printed PDFs, put them into named manila folders, sealed them with tape and my initials, and placed them into a locking cabinet that, on paper, held records for a pending audit. I took inventory photos of every folder with a time-stamped camera app, so there was another layer of evidence that the physical copies existed at a specific time and place. Once in the early hours, I signed for a courier box at the building and asked him to hold it overnight. The box contained nothing more than a clean USB drive and a copy of the checklist Rachel had suggested, but the act of sending and receiving created a trail I could point to later. I was careful with communications. I drafted short, neutral emails that could be produced as legitimate business correspondence. When I wanted to record who had been in a meeting or who had seen a chart, I sent a recap email to the same group that had attended and CC'd my own secure account. That practice did not look like whistleblowing, it looked like leadership following up. In cases where privacy was required, I met Rachel in a rented conference room offsite and left no notes in the car. Tom met me for coffee twice and showed me how to export audit logs in a way that preserved their integrity without ever touching restricted admin consoles. Keeping my face in the room felt like acting, but it was a necessary performance. I continued to lead weekly reconciliations, to correct footnote entries, and to joke about the team being short of coffee. When an executive asked me a technical question, I answered with the steady competence that had carried me through 9 years. Behind the polite cadence, I had rehearsed a timeline of events. Who had seen the chat and when, which transfers lined up with those messages, which approvals had been booked under innocuous descriptions. I mapped it all in a binder that looked from the outside like just another operations manual. Every now and then loneliness crept in, a pressure that made my throat hurt. I imagined what it would look like if someone smelled out what I was doing. I had contingency plans, but the possibility of being wrong, of toppling lives unnecessarily, weighed on me, so I tightened the methodology. If a copy seemed likely to attract attention, I did not take it. If a path to proof required stepping outside legal bounds, I abandoned it and found another route. The work was patient, methodical, and entirely solitary. Weeks passed and the timeline grew thicker. What had started as scattered exports and a couple of photos had become a packet with continuity, dates, and corroborating signatures where I could get them. I had not confronted anyone, I had not made accusations in the open, and I had kept my hands from anything that would look like tampering. To those around me, I remained Marcus Hale, competent and calm. Behind my practiced smile, however, I was building a record that could not be swept away by a friendly nod and a memo about internal housekeeping. The public crack was smaller than I had imagined and wider than I was ready for. A clerk at the SEC called first, polite and brisk, and asked me some baseline questions about a submission I had made. I answered with the same measured cadence I had used in the office for 9 years. Then the calls multiplied. Within 72 hours, auditors arrived at our offices carrying tablets and subpoenas. The first thing they did was verify timestamps against the server headers I had preserved. That detail, the innocuous line of metadata I had learned to value like a fingerprint, nudged their curiosity into a full inquiry. Accounts were frozen the next morning. Treasury called in the auditors and told operations to stop all transfers pending review. I watched from the corridor as the trading desk emptied like a theater after a sudden intermission. Screens blinked, traders packed notebooks into backpacks, and somewhere someone whispered that the firm had been placed on a restricted list. The hum of the office shifted into a higher register of anxiety. I felt it oddly as proof that what I had done had weight. The emergency audit laid everything bare in ways memos never could. Approval chains were pulled into spreadsheets line by line. Transfers that had been buried under vague descriptions appeared with timestamps and originating accounts. I sat in a conference room and watched a senior partner who had once clapped me on the shoulder, as if to say we were on the same team, answer questions about an approval she had authorized with a laugh in a chat log. The laugh read differently when an auditor read it aloud in a formal room with lawyers present. Jokes about parking discrepancies stopped being jokes, they echoed like confessions. Executives who had expected a quiet, internal tidy-up suddenly had to account for specific entries, for who had seen what and when. The casual group messages that had once felt like an inside club became a paper trail that tied names to decisions. One vice president tried to explain that the language had been flippant and contextless. He stumbled over dates and the auditors produced server headers to show the timing. His explanation dissolved. Another executive whose tone in the chat had been cavalier sat with his head in his hands while counsel dictated a statement. Contracts were renegotiated within days. Counterparties who had been comfortable with our firm before grew nervous and demanded extra covenants, collateral, and indemnities. Our largest institutional client instituted a review clause and reduced exposure. Those actions rippled outward, forcing immediate liquidity calculations and a flurry of board meetings that condensed months of governance into a single week. Bonuses were put on hold and then clawed back. I read the memo about clawbacks at my kitchen table, the paper trembling slightly in my fingers. It listed names I had known for years and the monetary sums that would be contested. For some, that contestation meant the end of careers that had been built around the assumption of competence and reward. HR sent a list of separations before the end of the first week. People I had laughed with in the break room cleared desks into boxes with faces that were a combination of defiance and disbelief. Some were clearly connected to the transfers and entries we had traced. Others seemed to be collateral good employees who had been caught on the wrong side of a restructuring driven by the sudden loss of trust. There were no dramatic scenes, no fist fights or shouting. Most of the careers simply ended in polite HR language, severance packages with non-disclosure requirements, and sign-offs that left little room for explanation. That kind of ending felt designed to minimize spectacle while maximizing finality. I received a mixture of gratitude and fury. A junior analyst sent me a private message saying he did not know how to thank me enough. A former teammate left a voicemail that began with support and ended in accusation. How could I have done this without talking to them, he asked. I wanted to tell him everything, to hand him the binder and the printed headers and the time-stamped photos. Instead, I told him the truth in the only way I could at that moment. I said that I had consulted counsel, preserved a chain of custody, and that I had made a choice I believed necessary. It sounded antiseptic even to my own ears. Outside the office, the story metastasized into headlines. Newspapers framed it as a scandal that cost a firm millions. Television anchors invited former regulators to explain the suddenly public chat lines, and panels debated whether the firm had cultural rot or a few bad apples. There were op-eds that celebrated whistleblowers and others that warned about reckless disruption. I read a column that called my action noble and another that accused me of seeking attention. Neither captured the quieter truth, which was that I had been trying to reconcile my conscience with the possible collateral damage of exposure. The immediate consequence I had expected was public, hard, and necessary. What surprised me was how quickly the internal architecture of trust collapsed. People who had relied on the old, implicit codes found themselves under microscope. Meetings that used to be about strategy turned into sessions about legal exposure. The firm tried to signal continuity. The CEO sent an email promising cooperation. The language felt engineered to restore calm, but audits do not listen to tone. They listen to ledgers and logs and server headers, and those things do not lie. I did not feel triumphant in a simple way. There was relief, certainly, when the logs I had preserved were validated, and when the auditors stopped questioning my motives and began to interrogate the transactions themselves. But the relief was tangled with a hum of sorrow for people who were swept up, and a gnawing awareness that the landscape of my professional life had changed irreversibly. The first public crack had widened fast and left fragments that would take months to catalog. I had forced truth into daylight, and daylight was not gentle. What I learned was not simple catharsis. The regulator's inquiry hemorrhaged millions from the firm and rearranged lives in ways that paperwork never could fully capture. Some people who had helped themselves to advantage were criminally exposed. Others were collateral damage, competent people who had spent years doing their jobs well and who suddenly found their names attached to a scandal that was not of their making. I watched faces I had once trusted hollow out with the same slow clarity I had seen on the ledger when numbers were shifted to hide a gap. At home, the cost felt less abstract and more intimate. My wife kept the paper with the newspaper clipping folded between the pages of a cookbook, as if the headline had to be tucked away like a recipe she did not want to make. My son heard a classmate mention my name and came home asking if I had done something wrong. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to explain to an 8-year-old the difference between hiding and protecting, between making a mistake and covering for it. He drew a picture of our house and labeled it safe in thick blue crayon. I taped it to the fridge and wondered how long it would take before that word felt untrue to him. Rebuilding trust at home was not a single conversation. It was 100 small ones. It was my wife watching me pause before checking the news, a deliberate decision to share details without making the house a courtroom. It was my saying yes when she suggested family therapy, and the awkward first session where the therapist asked me what guilt looked like to me. Guilt, I answered, was a file I kept opening and closing to check that what I had done was still the right thing. Gratitude, I learned, was quieter. It arrived in the way my wife packed my lunch the week after the first court subpoena, and in the way my son hugged me in the doorway when he said good night. Professionally, the aftermath was not simple either. Offers came, which surprised me. Recruiters I had not spoken to in years tracked me down with polite emails that suggested discretion and second chances. Some opportunities smelled of risk and potential exile. I turned most down. I did not want to move into another office that would reward silence or encourage moral flexibility. One firm invited me to speak about controls and ethics. I debated accepting because I wanted to influence culture without becoming a public figure. In the end, I agreed to a small teaching role at a university finance class, where I could try to explain to future accountants that a clean ledger is not separate from a clean conscience. There were legal motions and depositions and a sense that the very scaffolding of the firm had to be rebuilt. Executives were sued and some quietly settled. Others lost licenses. Regulators drew sanctions that took years to unwind. That kind of restructuring is antiseptic in press releases and corrosive in the hallways. I ran into people at coffee shops who greeted me with a nod that carried both relief and calculation. A former colleague would cross the street rather than pass on the sidewalk. A neighbor whose child played on the same soccer team avoided eye contact at practice and then later offered a tentative wave. Sleep changed for me in ways I did not expect. At first it was jagged, punctuated by dreams of spreadsheets with decimal points that moved like fish. Over time, those dreams softened into long, weird sequences in which I watched the firm from a distance and tried to decide whether to shout. Waking up used to mean checking my phone for numbers and emails. Now it meant inventorying whether I had acted honestly that day. The moral ledger replaced my habit of reviewing markets first thing in the morning. It is an odd transition for someone who spent a career counting dollars, but I find the new tally steadier. I lost the illusion that my job could stand in for my character. The office had felt like a family, which is to say it was where allegiance often trumped scrutiny. The betrayal I experienced came from a place where trust was currency. That realization hurt more than any professional setback. I had to accept that loyalty to an employer is not an unconditional good when it shields wrongdoing. The executives who had used inside jokes to normalize shortcuts paid a price. They lost secrecy and privilege. I lost the convenient fiction that work, no matter how consuming, would be a total definition of who I was. The public reaction was predictably split. Some called me a hero, others called me reckless. Both labels felt insufficient because neither took into account the calculus of risk and consequence. I had weighed the potential fallout for innocent colleagues and my own family and still decided that leaving the discrepancy unreported was a greater harm. That decision made me an ally to truth and an enemy to expedient silence. There is one small ritual that keeps the decision concrete for me. After the initial submissions, I mailed a packet of the chat logs and the header files to the regulator, and I mailed an identical copy to myself. The regulator received them bureaucratically. I received mine in a manila envelope that I folded and refolded until the creases softened. I put it on a shelf in my office at home, not as a trophy but as a witness to a choice I had made. When doubt crowds in, I take the packet down and hold it between my palms like evidence of a life I no longer need to reconcile with silence. It is a stubborn thing, simple and paper, and in the quiet of my house I sometimes imagine it as a ledger in which truth is the only balance that matters.